Good morning and welcome to another episode of Drive With Me, show where I mostly complain into my camera, the camera of my phone, while I am mostly driving to work in the morning. So, welcome if this is your first time in particular. That's kind of how the format of the show works. And so today I actually had a little bit of a variety of topics that I wanted to touch on. And first off, I recorded a video yesterday. It'll be the one that launches or is published before this one. And there were a couple of kind of just misspoken moments or things that I don't believe I clarified effectively. And so I may put it like in a pinned comment or something on there as well, but I did want to briefly address it in this video. First off, I was briefly discussing like homosexual relationships, same-sex marriage, etc., and was basically stating or I was asking whether or not it harms other people, and was like, well, obviously not. Like it's unless they're doing something else that is a separate crime, homosexuality in and of itself does not harm anybody, right? And that was part of the standard I was trying to bring up as like what we should measure morality on in and values of our nation and a group of people, right, as Americans. And then I asked, now, but does it harm them personally? And I just kind of flippantly said, sure. And in my head, I was thinking, oh, it should come across really obviously that I'm being sarcastic. But as I rewatched it when I was editing it, I don't think it did. So I wanted to clarify that I don't believe at all that really any kind of non-traditional, non-heterosexual orientation is problematic at all. Some sexual practices can be dangerous, and when done in an unsafe manner, can lead to a higher rate of STD transmission or just general, health issues of various kinds. But almost everything that same-sex relationships can do, heterosexual couples can do also. So it's not exclusive to any of them. So did want to touch on that real quick. Just make sure that was abundantly clear. I am not over here saying like, oh yeah, homosexuals are just disproportionately harming themselves somehow. I don't know. So I wanted to make sure that was abundantly clear and that was not misunderstood, if at all possible. The second part was I was actually talking about my wife and I and how we met and how I do not regret the fact that she and I started dating about 9 years ago now. She had relatively recently been with another man for about 7 years, and they had been engaged and then had broken it off. And I made it sound like I basically just took her from him, like in either while they were engaged or like immediately after, like I was waiting in the wing. And so I did want to clarify that as well. That's not what happened. So my wife was, as I said, with actually a guy that I had known because we had worked together, funnily enough, at Taco Bell years back. We'd known each other for years already. And so they dated, were engaged for a while, several years out of their 7-year relationship. And then they were having issues on their own. And effectively, from my wife's perspective, she apparently ended it. And I say apparently because it caused problems later, because that was not his mentality. So actually, he's a guy that we still stay in touch with. We've kind of smoothed things out since then, but it was a rough go there for a number of years because he was very much under the impression that I functionally stole her. From my perspective, she was telling me we're no longer together. And we just slowly started texting more often, and then that turned into us hanging out, but in a platonic way. And then we started actually dating several months later. And this entire time, I'm under the impression that they're done for good. Turned out she still had the engagement ring. And this is not to slam her, because in her mind, it really was apparently over also. They had purposely cut things off, and she just hadn't given a number of his things back and hadn't gotten some of her stuff back from him. So they hadn't done that exchange, but she wanted to give it a minimum of a number of months before that happened. So I'm realizing as we're starting to talk into dates that there's still a pretty notable connection between them. And then he actually accuses me of stealing her, like, oh, this must have been going on for a while. I'm like, no, it really is new. Like, this isn't something that I had planned. I did not come into this with the intention of taking anyone from anybody, but I did end up really being drawn to her, and I felt very like a real like connection with her. I felt like we had a lot of the same foundational core values in our lives. We wanted generally the same things. We were flexible in many of the same areas. And by that time I had dated quite a bit. I was getting into my late 20s, and that it during my 20s is really, that was like peak dating time of my life, and I was getting honestly tired of it, and was interested in settling down. So it kind of happened to be just like a stars aligning moment, and I decided she was very much what I wanted. And so once I decided that and pursued her, I didn't really care whether or not my friend thought that they were still working on things. Almost, it reminds me of like Ross and Rachel from Friends. They're like, we were on a break, kind of thing. Like in his mind, they were apparently on a break. In her mind, they were done and just giving each other some space before they figured out next steps and how they were going to untangle things. She just hadn't broached that because she mentally was not interested in dealing with it at that point. That to him, the fact that they still had all their physical things, they weren't living together by this point, but that had happened even while they were engaged. So it was an interesting kind of, you know, declining scenario in the first place, but in his mind it apparently wasn't over, and he very much blamed me and held me accountable for that for a number of years. And what I'm getting at is, at the end of the day, I didn't care. I did not. It did not bother me enough knowing this, or that was his mindset, to back off or to avoid the conflict or anything like that. I was like, this is what I want. I let her know that was what I wanted, and we got married actually relatively quickly. We started dating in summer, and we were married by the next winter. So, like just a couple seasons later, I think our whole, because we had known each other, she and I, even for a number of years through my friends. So we'd known each other for something like 8 years or whatever already. And so when we dated, it didn't take very long for us to be like, okay, this is what we're doing, and we moved pretty quickly on it. And there was still issues even after we got married for a while, with some of the, I guess I'll just call it decluttering, the detaching of things, and who gave what back to who, and conversations. He even gave her a letter that was kind of like, it was kind of introspective and like, I'll always love you, and part of me still really feels like we're meant to be together, but I respect your decision, that kind of thing. And there were a couple of times that he called the cops and claimed that I was holding her hostage where we were living, and so that they showed up at our door, and there were some issues there for a bit. And but all told, it wound into my video from yesterday, because I was discussing, or that I recorded yesterday anyway. In regards to when it's published, it'll probably be several days before this one. But the core concept I was working on was, a nice guy does not inherently equal a good man, and a good man is not always a nice guy. And that's what I was getting at, is like, if I were trying and prioritizing being the nice guy, I probably would have handled things differently and may not have gone through with marrying my wife that I've now been with for about 9 years. But I wasn't, and I'm not, because I don't believe that should be the priority. I believe being a good man, it means sometimes you're going to upset people. Sometimes you're going to step on toes. That doesn't mean be cruel. That doesn't mean go out of your way to hurt people. It just means don't apologize for your priorities, and your focusing on those people and priorities that are the most important to you. So your family, yourself, your spouse, your children, etc. Those are my priority, and I don't really much care if I upset certain people in the process anymore, in any way close to the way that I did in my teens or in my 20s, right? Wherein friendship was more important, and spending time with people that I went to school with and so on was just a higher priority. Then now I could honestly really couldn't care a whole lot less. And it's funny how life works that way. Your priorities really, at least for a lot of us, really do just inherently change over time. So that was two of those comments that I wanted to touch on. Additionally, I realized that even though I went into my last video wanting to talk about the right's perceived almost monopoly on patriotism, and I touched on it a little bit. I realized I didn't hit as many of those like subtopics as I wanted to, so I wanted to expand on that a little bit. So this is kind of a part two, once again, to my previous video. And so there was a video that I had watched about how the right wing of American politics does not have a monopoly on masculinity. And on that same note, I very firmly believe it's tried to develop a monopoly, or at least a perceived one, on patriotism. And that if you are independent or left wing and not explicitly rah rah America, then you are just not patriotic. And I think it's not a very difficult concept to explain for most people. This will click pretty easily, but no, that's not how that works. So I believe being patriotic means, just like being real with ourselves is important as people, as one that works as a therapist, I believe that as a nation we need to do the same. We need to take a hard look at ourselves, look at that proverbial man in the mirror, as Michael Jackson is known for saying, right? And hold ourselves accountable for mistakes that we've made and do our best to correct for them, instead of trying to hide behind them and all the just explicitly good that we've see ourselves as having done, whether it's real or not, and acting like there really are no problems or we're the greatest country on the planet, because in reality we're not. We are a pretty great country. I love the United States. I love America, but I've been born and raised here, so I mean this place is home, right? But it is far from perfect, and our history is very far from perfect, and it is very important to be aware of that as far as I'm concerned. So things like colonial era sins, if you will, like intense racism, slavery, and its legacy of kind of thousands of years of history of men going out of their way to generally control women and control their families and so on. There are certain valid reasons for certain elements of how we've structured society in the past, right? Especially in a pre-industrial age. I also believe that many people in power have taken advantage of that for a long time, and that the real fight in the United States is and has pretty much always been a working class and middle class, mostly versus the upper class and elites, because those that are considered the upper crust of any given society are the ones that have a very disproportionate amount of influence and power and control over that given system. It's not just in the United States, it's all over. So while the US does have a history of making or attempting to make amends, right? Trying to push back against racism in various forms and against sexism and so on. We definitely still have a long way to go, and there have been some really messed up things we've done in the process of becoming the nation we are today, particularly for Native Americans and African Americans. Their histories have been notably tragic in many cases, and that's just reality. That's not woke nonsense or anything else. That is just hard, really undebatable, as far as I'm concerned, reality. And so we can both acknowledge the negative and the things that have really gone wrong, or things that have been very lopsided and immoral and unethical in the past, and also love America for what it's trying to be, and love the West and its values for what we are aspiring to become over time. So because of that, I very firmly believe that what often masquerades as patriotism on the right wing among many Republicans is really just ignorant nationalism. We are just rah rah America because we want to be rah rah America, and we feel like we want to push that narrative. This is the greatest country on the planet. If everybody just worked hard, they'd be okay. And if you didn't succeed, it's your fault. And a lot of the other nonsense that I hear from even members of my own family, much of that is not grounded in fact or reality. It ends up functioning like an ideology that they cling to because they want it to be true, and it's part of what they've developed their identity around. And they end up becoming rigid and unwilling to see anything that would prove contrary to that belief system. And something that many independents and more left-leaning folks of a variety of spots on that particular spectrum are far more willing to do that. And in fact, change becomes more natural and more desired just by default. The more left of this on the spectrum you tend to want to be, or tend to be as a person, right? So historically, the main difference and definition, like whether you're talking about France or China or the United States, doesn't really matter. Generally, there's a spectrum between what would traditionally be considered conservative and more liberal. And at the most basic layer, your conservatives are generally wanting to maintain tradition, and your liberals are generally wanting to enact change or reform. Everything else kind of flows through that. And in the reality is, in America, many like quote unquote left-wing people actually hold some very conservative positions, and many more conservative folks hold some very left-wing positions. And it also depends on the timeline. Like those that are conservative in modern America, or considered that, would have been classical liberals, and in fact stem from that tradition just a couple hundred years ago. They would have been those that were, really pushing to fight the American Revolution and expel the British and so on, for example. And so even the nature of what that means is relative and changes over time. So politics is an ever-changing beast. So if you hear things like, well, the Democratic Party is the party of civil rights, or the Democratic Party is the one that promoted slavery, or the Republican Party is the party of Lincoln that promoted and ended up pushing through abolition of slavery, for example, realize that the parties are constantly changing and that the titles are far less important than the party platforms and their specific positions on given issues. And one of the core ways to kind of get a decent idea of what it is you're dealing with is look at what regions of the country tend to vote for which parties, right? For example, the southern United States, the southeastern, the deep south, if you will, and those kind of in that orbit are generally more conservative leaning. They've been Democrats in the past, or called Jeffersonians or Jacksonians, depending on the time. And nowadays they're more Republican. And that lines up generally with what's considered conservative for that day and age. The party platform of the Southern Democrats of yesteryear is definitely different from the Republican Party platform of today. However, there are many core issues and core philosophies there that cause a pretty substantial amount of overlap. So take everything with a grain of salt and realize there's always nuance. It is never as simple as, oh, well, the party's flipped, or this party was this and this party was that, and therefore they are this today. That's just not accurate. Generally speaking, the Democratic Party today does still tend to be pretty tied to like the civil rights movement and that era of social expansion of rights and so on for women, for people of color, for like LGBT individuals and so on. However, it's kind of lost the plot, so to speak, with the working class over time. And I would say it's not as fervent of a supporter of civil rights as it used to be, or as it used to pretend to be. It at least put up a better show of it in previous decades. And so I find myself kind of rather disgusted with the Democratic Party as well. So that's a large part of the reason why I identify as independent, is because I believe that both parties are kind of terrible. They largely represent the same billionaire class. However, they do it differently, and they present themselves to the public differently and try to act like there's this profound binary. But when push comes to shove, they end up accomplishing many of the same things in different ways. And it's really just degrees. There are true differences, especially when you talk about Trump. Trump has introduced kind of what might become a new era in American politics. He's definitely been an outlier compared to more modern post-World War II presidents, that's for sure. He's governing more like a president from the 1800s would have, like or the early 1900s, right? Like more imperialist and more might makes right, and we don't really care about even pretending that we're not racist, and or care about other people that aren't explicitly in my voter base or what have you. Depending on how you look at it, Trump is just, he's an interesting character, man. And I there are certain things that, at least that he campaigned on, that I agreed with on a fundamental level, but then how he applies it, like, well, we need to fix immigration, or we need to drain the swamp. Like, yeah, absolutely we do. And then he goes about it in some of the weirdest or most ineffective or still corrupt ways possible, at least as far as I can tell. I'm like, well, that's disappointing, because I was hoping he would be more than what I was afraid he would be, and he really hasn't been. He's been almost exactly what, especially in the second term, he was much more predictable this time, in my opinion. The first time, I was legitimately caught off guard. I didn't expect him to get the nomination in the first place. I really didn't. And I watched those early Republican debates. At that time, I considered myself pretty middle of the road back in like 2016, and so I watched Republican and Democratic debates and was like, well, where am I at here? And I tended to mostly be drawn to Bernie Sanders, and liked some on the Democratic side, and then liked some of what Trump said, but also thought the guy was just a bully. And was like, man, I don't see this joker actually getting it. My God, was I wrong, and I have no problem admitting that at all. I did not see this coming 10 years ago at all. So we are where we are now, and I hope we have some positive things that emerge from the Trump administration, especially this 2.0 one we're in now. But I'm definitely not holding my breath, and I suspect it's mostly a series of giveaways to various forms of allied big business interest, is my suspicion of what's going on here. Reminds me of the spoils system that we had during the 1800s, where political allies would get a lot of rewards and political appointees and government contracts and all sorts of stuff like that, because they were allied with the president who ended up being elected and came to power. And we went out of our way to explicitly not allow that kind of system anymore, and we're drifting back towards it. So history is never stagnant, and just because you fought a battle once does not mean that it's actually over. That's the nature of freedom and democracy, and the anti-corruption and anti consolidation of power in the hands of the few kind of fight that we find ourselves in as a species. It's not explicitly American. It is just human. It requires vigilance. It's like that very conservative phrase that freedom isn't free. That, like, it really is true. But often it's perceived as, it means we need to be willing to take up arms and fight for our rights. And sometimes that's the case. It also means being aware and educating ourselves to the best of our ability, and networking with each other, and maintaining strong labor unions and trade relations in general, and so on, so that workers have a voice, and making sure that the least powerful among us have a voice and have a say in how things progress in this nation, and actually promoting the values that we say we do. Because if we don't, or we allow them to start being corrupted, the ones who invariably benefit the most are the ultra wealthy. It is those with the most power. And it's excuse me, it's kind of like a funny graph, wherein if you look at the amount of power and influence that somebody has based on their socioeconomic level, right? Like, those that are poor have very little influence on how politics goes. And then the more wealthy you get, there's a slight increase over time, right? And then there's like the top fraction of 1%, and it just bounces, right? And that's how wealth also has worked. And so with that wealth that is just very disproportionately crowded at a very small pinpoint tip at one end of the spectrum, that so has political power slowly moved that way. And it's getting increasingly brazen about how it's applied, particularly here in the United States. So it is, I believe that recent presidential candidacies, both Trump and Biden, their administrations kind of represent a massive failure of the system that came before it. And I suspect we'll look on this era as a transition period to something different. None of us, unless you've seen the future, none of us know exactly what it is that looks like. I have no idea what we're going to be looking at on the other side. This could lead to a rebirth of representative democracy and an era of reform that we haven't seen since the New Deal era ushered in and back in the 1930s. And it could be we're about to start our dictator phase and we're about to transition into a wannabe Roman Empire over here. And I sincerely hope it's closer to the former. Obviously, it could be any number of variety of expressions in between, but I'm sincerely hoping it's more we have a reform period as opposed to an imperial period. But we might have to go through the hard one to get to something better. So anyway, if you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. I was a little bit scattershot today in terms of the topics, but ultimately, I think I got my point across here that I'd wanted to discuss, starting with my previous video that I recorded yesterday, and hopefully, America and the world moves in a better direction over time. And part of that is by waking up and having that conversation with each other and starting to hold ourselves individually and collectively accountable, increasingly for where this nation goes and the small steps that we can take collectively to make positive impact. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a grassroots movement. It's going to take a lot of people getting angry, right? This almost definitely gets worse before it gets better, but we can do it. Humanity has survived far worse and come out the other side. It can be and hopefully will be done again. So thank you for watching again. If you made it this far, feel free to like the video if you did. And otherwise, if you want to hear more about politics, technology, economics, culture, etc., then please stick around. We'll be talking about it later.